Zoom. So welcome everyone to this evening's program. I'm excited to talk about the path to the boardroom. Some of you that may have been on last year, we talked about kind of how to get on a board 101, and tonight's discussion will be how to get on a board 2.0. A couple little housekeeping things just as a reminder. We don't have a board education program in August. We're taking the month of August off, but come back on September 20th. We have Willow Shire and Jill Wittels with Ellen Ridgestone, and they're going to be talking about the role of a board versus the role of management. And I'll tell you, we've already prepped for the discussion, and I'm really excited for the discussion. So please be sure to sign up. The other piece of housekeeping is we do have in October 2 events. One will be a discussion with Emily Taylor on kind of legal updates about boards 2.0. And then there'll be a panel discussion. So be looking on the bostonclub.com so that you could sign up for those events. And then we've got events already starting. We're planning for 2022 as we speak. Tonight, I want to introduce Ellen and turn it over to her and Dee Dee. Most of you know who Ellen is. A couple of you may be new to our program. Ellen has served on boards for over 18 years. Her experiences range from micro caps up to S&P 500 companies. She has an operating background. She was a former Fortune 500 CFO and a former CEO of a privately held company. Today, she sits on, I believe, Ellen, it's 3 boards today?
3 public boards.
3 public boards today. She has expertise in finance, technology, manufacturing, global business, and M&A. She is, you may also know Ellen because she is the program director at NACD New England. Some of you may have attended that boot camp. There's a really good boot camp in March. Looking again, that date will be March 2022 for aspiring directors. And she's also an NACD board leadership fellow. So I'm really excited that Ellen, you could be here and be our moderator with Dee Dee. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I think everyone knows really this program is about Dee Dee, which is she is our keynote speaker. We are all going to learn from her. I am sure that I will be learning from Dee Dee along with everybody else. So I met Dee Dee, I think 5-7 years ago at an amazing event that Egon Zehnder put on. Egon Zehnder, Dee Dee is at Egon Zehnder. She's one of the executives there. She is involved in their board, CEO, and leadership advisory practices. She's remarkable. Every time I have a conversation with her, as I said, I learned something, which is phenomenal. And Egon Zehnder itself, I'm a big fan of. I've seen them from both sides of the board practice, both having placed me on a few boards, as well as using them from a board practice advisory services, if you will. So it's a great pleasure to have Dee Dee here today. And really, she's there. I am going to be watching the chat boards. So any questions, throw in the chat. I'm going to try and intersperse them during the conversation. There will be time at the end to catch up on any questions that we haven't otherwise caught on to. And so with that, I think, Hillary, you need to go to slides, and Dee Dee is literally, it's got an amazing set of slides to go through with you.
So I'll jump in. Okay, perfect. Well, one, thank you for letting me join you. I've been looking forward to this. Longer story about my internet connection today. So I'm going to be leaning in. If at any point you can't hear me, I will dial in because I just want to make sure that we're able to have kind of a lively and engaging discussion. Thank you for that introduction. So I am a member of the board practice at Egon Zehnder, which is a talent advisory firm. I was an attorney. I did corporate governance consulting. I worked with boards before even joining the firm, providing a lot of counsel to boards as they were actually trying to figure out how to tackle Sarbanes-Oxley. That's how a lot of the work started. And from there, we realized that there were more opportunities for board education, looking at board effectiveness, and then ultimately thinking about board composition. And so because of that work, I was able to join Egon Zehnder, where I spent a lot of time there. I'm even more excited because I also lead our diversity, equity, and inclusion practice for North America. And so, as you can imagine, and with the conversation that we're going to have today, there's a lot of overlap. Not all of it has been, I'd say it's been a long time coming. It'll be a long time going, but you all are going to be part of that. So, let's dig in and have some fun. Again, as questions arise, and also with Ellen's like kind of rich tapestry of experiences as well, hopefully you won't just have to listen to me the whole time. The last thing I'll say is the slides that we're sharing, there's a lot of information. We won't go through every single slide in this deck, but we will share the deck with you afterwards. And so you'll see it's a good resource just to have to understand kind of what's happening and also what we look for, right, when we are talking to you about these opportunities. All right, so maybe if we can go to the first. So it's not lost on me. It's probably not lost on you that, the world's been somewhat crazy over, I would say, certainly the last 18 months, but really even over the last 5 to 10 years, right, where we've seen a shift. We've seen a shift in what companies and what boards are looking for in terms of their own composition. We've seen a shift for companies. A lot of companies we've heard that word disruption. I'm sure you've heard it day in, day out, in terms of various industries which had operated in linear or legacy ways, which now we're then faced with dealing with new ways of engaging in technology, new generations of employees, new expectations of CEOs, right? So there's a lot that's been happening for companies, and those stresses on companies have direct implications for who's being brought onto boards these days. On top of that, you pile on COVID, you pile on, I think if somebody can go on mute, okay. I'll keep going. But you pile on COVID, you look at if you look at the social and political unrest of the last year and a half as well, and then you add on kind of the challenge for companies to take on new business models, to continue to be at the forefront of digital innovation, right? To actually engage and kind of justify their activities, not just as businesses, but as contributors to society. It's a lot. And what we're seeing is that those pressures have actually impacted the composition of boards and actually the mandates that we're getting to recruit. So what's the so what of that? What does that mean for you all? What does that mean for kind of me and our work? It means that what we've seen is that we've actually seen a dramatic shift, right, in terms of the expectation and what we're being asked to look for when we're thinking about board composition. Historically, you may have heard this expression, kind of PMS. People have talked about pale, male, and stale as being kind of what the composition of boards used to be like. And then we saw a shift. We saw a shift in both from I would say from kind of market demand, from legislative demand. We started to see a shift towards actually greater interest and actually, I'd say, kind of greater request and requirement to have female directors on the board. And I would say that shift has evolved even further. So today, if I think about the work that we get and what our clients are asking us for, I would say probably 60 to 70% of the mandates that we get from clients, they are telling us that what they want is actually, they want to look at slates of candidates, and they'd ideally like to see women and people of color. So when we say the focus is on women and BIPOC, for those for whom this might be a new expression, what we're referring to is actually Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so it is not uncommon now for most of our clients to say, we have these seats and we have specifically said we would like to see women and people of color onto the board. What does that mean? And what are the implications for that? It means that first and foremost, while we're looking at women and people of color, there's always the comment, but we'd like somebody with board experience, or we'd like a sitting CEO, right? And if you think about it, the same structural impediments that have made it difficult to have this composition on the board are those that have made it difficult to find and kind of really have this vast pool of women and people of color who are already sitting on boards or who are sitting CEOs. On top of it, those who are sitting on boards have likely been quite attractive to every single board and might find many times they are at capacity. They're either sitting execs who have a board, or they are, they're overboarded. And so I mention this, why? Because what it has done is it's changed the nature of the conversation that we're having with a lot of our clients, where we're really actually trying to take a different, more flexible approach to the kinds of backgrounds that we are engaged, that we're looking at. We're trying to really understand what are the true skill sets that are required, as opposed to looking at what classically were certain roles, right? And this is what has afforded us kind of greater opportunity to, again, bring more women and people of color onto boards. So what we show here is that actually the skills and experiences that people are looking for, we continue to, I'll come back to questions, or I can come back to questions. But what we're looking for and what we're looking at, right? There's still a heavy emphasis on looking at kind of sitting members of the C-suite. So looking at CEOs, looking at COOs, and really when we unpack that, they're looking for that P&L responsibility. They want to see some of that general management experience. But as we kind of unpack that further and say, well, okay, what else are you looking for, right? Because I'm sure everybody here on this call could talk about their GM experience. The other places where we see kind of a request for specific expertise is in finance, in technology, cybersecurity, kind of investment experience. And actually, this number that you're seeing in terms of kind of human capital, that's now starting to go up. We are seeing kind of more willingness and openness to having kind of CHROs on boards. And of course, that entrepreneurial founder startup DNA for those companies that are looking to bring on a kind of a new generation of leadership.
Edie, before you keep going, let me just grab one of the questions that was in chat, which was really came back to the definition of BIPOC, and it was wondering whether that included Hispanics or Asian or other types of perhaps underrepresented minorities on boards.
So I would say, oh yeah, go ahead.
No, what else is in that number besides people of color?
So I would actually say, so it does include, I would say, we have seen kind of Hispanic, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and in some of our clients are kind of going even beyond that in terms of actually, I would say, it's race, ethnicity, also, kind of geographic, kind of we're looking for geographic diversity as well. So bringing in leaders who are based, have experience in, are coming from kind of other countries of interest as well. So I would say it's quite broad, right? In terms of what our remit is, and we take it that way because that's the best way for us to kind of actually pull together, right, true inclusive slates. The goal at the end of the day is not necessarily the idea is by kind of broadening it, we're bringing kind of greater expertise, we're bringing greater lived and professional experiences into the boardroom, right? So I would say our clients are asking for kind of, they're going across the board.
So before you leave this slide, let me just ask another related question, which is, so we've got along this slide, we've got executive leadership, finance, technology, and then you've got the other, bullets of things that are still coming up. Is it safe to say that most boards, it may not be everybody, but most boards will come to you, they want certain skills, and then, oh, by the way, the slates have to have, women, people of color, but they start with the skill. Is that still correct generally, realizing there's always going to be an exception out there, but general thought.
So, and then you can go, and actually we can use the next slide as a way to kind of, the next couple of slides to speak to that. So that is true. We always start with what are the skills that we're looking to bring on the board. Oh, I think this might be, I have a skills matrix, but you guys will see it if it's not in the in this deck. You'll see it in what gets sent to you. But I would say most of our clients actually have compiled, and we do this work with them as well, which is a skills matrix. And so what does that mean? It means that they've actually done an analysis, right, of their current board, right? And we do that, we can sometimes go in and do that where we're looking at, demographics and director backgrounds. And so a lot of companies will have will take let's say they're 8 to 12 directors, and they will have an analyzed age. They will look at kind of the tenure of the individuals on the current board. They will kind of look at kind of what directors are sitting on what committees, right? And then they'll also look at, okay, the experiences that we have. How many public company CEOs do we have on the board today, right? How many active CEOs, kind of sitting CEOs? How many independent directors do we have? And then they'll start to break down and ask, okay, do we have a financial expert on the board? Do we have somebody who has M&A experience? Do we have, digital technology? So a lot of boards will actually have their own kind of matrix of what currently exists on the board, and they can use that as a way to then complement or amplify a particular need. So they will lead us with, okay, this is where we are, this is where we'd like to complement the board. And then, of course, on top of that, we would like to make sure that we are bringing in an underrepresented minority or woman to the board, or I'd say kind of non-male identifying executive to the board, if that's helpful.
Yeah, so before you leave this chart, the thing I'm always challenged with, and the good news is we're making progress. The bad news is, I mean, when I think of boards below the S&P 500, I still think the stats are worse. Is that also what you see, even though we think it's getting better?
We think, yes, I think I would say we think it's getting better. If you actually look at all boards, right? The reality is this progress is slow, right? And that's important for a few reasons. If you just read headlines alone, right? If you just kind of listen to trends and what have you, you would think, okay, well, every single board is looking for me. Every single board has 30 seats, right? And everybody's going to get a phone call, and and that's not the reality, right? Why we are, just the basic math in terms of seats that are even opening up, right? There aren't that many seats that open up on a board. And so just the opportunity to add a new director is not as frequent as you might think. And then on top of that, you have to think about who you're bringing onto the board. So the numbers, we want them to be better. They aren't there yet, right? But you all help us. You guys will help us.
And the Boston Club is going to help a lot.
You will.
Dee, I think I got the up-to-date deck, so.
Oh, perfect. Maybe if you go to that, just to show you, I'm not going to go into detail, but I want you to see, when I'm talking before about a skills matrix, this is what I'm talking about. So it's an analysis, again, just of the current board, and they can use this to say, okay, this is what we'd like to bring, right? Often when we're kicking that off, and that's part of why when you're doing your pitches, helping to bring to life some of these skills is helpful for us to say, okay, well, we're working on this search. We need a QFE. We need a qualified financial expert. We want to talk to you about that, right? So these matrices are helpful.
So there's a question, from Babs saying, from a lot of proxies, you can produce a skills gaps metrics to see where you might fill a gap. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I'll just say, yes, but actually, a lot of boards are now actually producing and putting this exact sort of skills matrix, in their proxies. But it doesn't really tell you what the future expectations are. Do you use these skills matrices? How or do you create your own when you get an assignment? This is a starting point, what's in the proxy, but you really spend time with the board.
We spend time with
you, right?
Yeah, so we create our own. We spend time, and it's true. We want to understand. We want to understand kind of what are some of the, even today, the strategic imperatives, right? And going forward, what are some of the risks that that they're also trying to bring some expertise to manage against as well, right? Because often it might be that they have the right group for today, but they know that this is something is coming, and they'd like expertise, from a particular region, kind of, or particular industry, or what have you. So this helps to prompt a conversation. And again, for you all, what it does, for you as you're thinking about what you may bring, know that the board is thinking about, they are trying to think about bringing on different skills, and as well as sound judgment.
So there's a question in chat that asks about, and I'll start, it asks about age, but then I'll go on to term limits. Is there sort of a maximum age that the oldest you can be to get on your first board? In other words, when are you've lost your opportunity because people aren't going to put you on?
Well, I will say this, I think, and I might have my stats wrong, but I think about 70% of the S&P 500 have an age limit, and that age limit has been creeping up. So back in 2010, it was 70, and I think more often than not, it's 75 these days, right? So they do still exist. About 77 to 80% of the directors who left a board in the last year did it because of mandatory retirement age, right? And so it is something that we look at, right? The chances are, if you're looking to bring a director onto a board, and let's say our expectation is they will serve on the board for, let's say, 6 to 10 years, then looking at a candidate who is 73 doesn't make as much sense, right? And so it is a question that it is something that we consider.
So let me ask it differently, because I have, of my 3 boards, one has age 75, and that happens to be the largest, right? So that's
Mhm.
but my other two are smaller, and they actually have no age limits. Is that sort of the trend, if you will, that the sort of mid cap to small cap probably don't have as much in terms of age limits? I
will
just don't know if that's a trend or not.
I will say that a lot may not, but are now inviting the conversation. So we've been right, and then part of it has been spurred by various initiatives to create more seats, to kind of open up seats. And so they're looking at, so some of the smaller companies are looking at, or as we're doing more kind of board effectiveness work, right? And as we're looking at, kind of what we would say is good governance. And as you hear more and more about these topics around board refreshment, some are now starting to have conversations both around term limits, which are not that usual, right? But term limits as well as age.
So given the pressures of, and this comes from the chat, of the fact that when you're a C-suite executive, that at least as a CEO, I've seen many companies say their board, their CEO can only sit on one external board because of all the time and effort it takes. Is that really the prevalent view at this point?
Yeah, we operate under the expectation that if you're a sitting C-suite executive, you have one board, right? That you have one outside board that you would take. That's, that's, I think, good practice and good governance. And also from a capacity standpoint, right? We would have questions if actually, we would have questions actually if there was a sitting C-suite executive who was taking on anything more.
What about term limits? We don't really talk about term limits in the US. You talk about term limits more outside the US, at least in my experience, but.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. So actually, I would say they're unusual in the US and kind of, and talked about frequently outside of the US, right? We have seen, and we've done different studies, right, in terms of around director performance. And statistically, what we have seen or what we know is that board director performance kind of peaks at 8 years, meaning it's a curve. So there's a lot of justification for longer terms. But as I mentioned, when we are actually recruiting, we are looking for somebody to commit to anywhere from 6 to 10 years on the board. That's kind of, again, that's some back of the envelope math.
Do we want Hillary to move on, I think?
Oh, yes, please.
Sorry.
No problem.
Probably so I think next slide, right?
Yeah. So the next slide, again, this is really just to kind of, this is actually trying to talk a little bit about, this isn't just a US question, right? I would say these are global trends. So we've seen gender mandates that have been in place. We know that there's more work to be done, but the conversations that are taking place on this topic are not just here. They're happening globally. So that's all. We just wanted to cover that. And that some of this is, again, this will be for your reference. This will be for your reference later. But the point that we want to make is that actually this trend towards bringing greater diversity into the boardroom is a combination of push and pull, right? I don't think from our conversations and even some of the work that we're doing separately, and some of our conversations with NASDAQ, the SEC and others, I don't think you're going to see a reversal of this trend, right? In fact, I think you are going to see, whether mandated or not, the expectation, and quite frankly, is, and I think people will give scrutiny to boards that have not given, that have not really made these commitments. You'll see greater scrutiny. We can pass through. And I think we want to talk a little bit about the board recruitment process, right? This is why you guys are all here, right? What is that path to the boardroom? And so as I kind of alluded to before, one thing people, potential directors will ask us, or candidates will ask us, is, okay, well, what's going to impact this process for me, right? What can I control versus what can't I control? And here it's important to note that, okay, there are these outside, there are always going to be outside factors that are going to, impact our ability to recruit you. And those are beyond your control, right? So those, that has to do with what are the broader market dynamics? What is the strategic need of the companies out there, right? What are some regulatory requirements, kind of how, what mandates are or do not exist, right? Or the thing that's not out of your control. We talked about this, the number of seats, right? This is not we can try, but you may not will it to happen, especially when we're not talking about term limits. And you have people who are getting onto boards earlier and living longer, right? There's this kind of, the question is, you need a seat to open up. That is in some ways beyond your control. However, there are things that are in your control, and that's actually your value proposition, your role in the process, and your preparation, right? We started off with talking about the elevator pitch. We'll come back to that, but you thinking about kind of to the extent that you have control, your messaging, the work that you've done to kind of distill why now, is something that you can control and can start working on, right? These, I mean, again, we can kind of breeze through these, but the idea here is, again, that the important takeaway here is that there are always going to be external factors that impact the pace with which and the availability for opportunities, but we want to focus on the things that are within your control, right? And so in thinking about the things that are within your control, we talked about your value proposition. And we use this can be, maybe it's a useful guide to just kind of thinking about your candidacy. So when we're going into a conversation with you, right, on our end, what we're thinking about is, okay, your motivation for doing this, right? Kind of how attractive are you as a candidate, right? So and performance, kind of tell us a little bit. So tell us, what is your track record, right? What have you done, right? And how does what you've done inform how you're going to show up in the boardroom, right? And all of that your motivation, your attractability, your performance, all of that kind of comes together in your story. So this is kind of what Ellen was talking. I know Ellen has been talking to some of you about, but how do you actually take all of these great attributes and experiences and your interest and motivation and pull it together in something that is concise, that is compelling, that honestly, at the end of the day, I just say that makes you memorable, right? So if I will tell you right now, I will give an example. And this is, I'm doing a search right now, almost every other search that I'm doing right now, because of all the SPACs, everybody's kind of getting their boards ready, right? Kind of trying to professionalize their boards. We have a lot of QFE mandates. A lot of people are looking for that next audit chair. And wouldn't it be great if we could have a woman or a person of color who's also the audit chair? So you're talking to lots of people who actually on paper all have great experiences. But I can tell you that as soon as I get on the call, I can be excited based off of what I see on paper. As soon as I get on the call, I can tell within the first few minutes whether or not this is going to be a person I'm going to want to spend more time with, right? And it's because of that story, right? So, you know, we just did this. We have two people who looked great. The client was really excited to dig into them. I met both and said, okay, well, I know the one you're going to talk to, even though the experiences looked the same. So being able to have that compelling story, right? And also to communicate in a way that kind of suggests what you would be like in the boardroom is really critical. So we use this slide for you to understand kind of how we're thinking about you when we're talking to you. When we are more of how the sausage is made on our side. So when
Dee Dee, let me just pause for a second, because I think I was going to ask this question later, but I think based on what you said related to how you compare people, are there things when individuals are talking to someone like yourself? So the chances are good that you're talking to someone you've got a thought process going that is, you know, how does this person fit? Are there sort of lessons learned, things a potential director shouldn't say or shouldn't do in a conversation with you? Sort of, what are the big no-nos? That's a bad choice of words. I'm sorry.
No, I would say, so one of the things I see often is almost thinking of this discussion with me as an interview for an executive role, right? And often what will happen is we can go down a whole path and a laundry list of, these are the things I do. Here's my set of activities. Essentially, this is what I do, right? You're an executive and you go down this path and you get into a laundry list. And what happens is I leave the conversation and I'm thinking, well, they're busy. They do a lot of things, but what is actually, I don't have a sense of kind of the strategic contribution that they might make, right? I don't know, I don't have a sense of how they would be in the boardroom. I have a good sense of how they might be as a COO or a CFO or a chief marketing officer, but not a good sense of actually kind of how, you know, their kind of enterprise-wide impact, right? How they've thought about kind of managing risk, how they think about and kind of what they would be like in the, you know, kind of how those activities that they've just taken me down the path of, like, what does that mean for you as a board director, right? So when I start going down the path of, well, I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this, what was the impact of that on the business? And why is that important, right?
So it's always thinking in terms of the value add you bring to the board.
To the board, right? You could be, if you are a COO who's done a ton of things, that's great. If you have navigated, you know, turnaround after turnaround after turnaround, and you've kind of become quite facile with kind of crisis management, and I'm dealing with a company like that, that's more interesting to me, right? Or if you've been in a series of legacy businesses that are actually, and then you've also kind of navigated that transition or transformation from being, you know, brick and mortar to e-commerce, or from being, you know, print to digital, or what have you. Those are, you know, now I'm thinking, okay, this is why you'd be good, because we're in a similar predicament and you have some, right? Versus I do this on a daily basis.
So there's one question on the chat, you know, the story you told about the two women who looked the same on paper. And so what was it that compelled you to choose one over the other? I mean, was it the personality? Was it somehow their communication? Was it that they, what differentiated it? This is really hard. I realize.
Yeah, no, it's so I'm going to use these two women because again, it is so. So the difference was actually my sense in terms of their readiness was based off of the stories they chose to then share with me. So they had these experiences, and this was a case, again, in this case, this is an industry, it's an industry that sits at this intersection of kind of media and they're kind of media and marketing, right? And what they were looking for and what they're struggling with is actually the fact that they've been doing things. They're kind of like a back office for media and marketing, and they actually need to come up to speed and be a bit more digital in terms of kind of the services, and that'll actually open up the market for them. And they're also trying to grow in the US. Now, the one woman was actually, in her stories, what I felt or sensed was that she had done some research on the company that we were talking about. Again, this is now, if we're talking, I've probably given you some information on the company, or you've done some diligence. And she started telling stories that suggested that she would actually be really helpful in the boardroom. The other person just kind of walked me through the CV that I had. And, just kind of walked me through the sets, the tasks and the responsibilities. I already kind of have a sense of if you've been a serial CFO, I know the functions that have reported to you, right? I have a good sense, but she didn't really bring it to life in a way. She kind of just read me her resume, right? And
So
when
it
I asked him, oh, go ahead.
It keeps coming back to your point you made earlier, which is being able to present yourself with the values or the added value you will bring to the boardroom, and what out of your experience is particularly helpful.
And that your experience, short of being the CEO, right? Your experience is not just about your expertise in that function, right? You're actually talking to me about your impact on the enterprise, right? Because again, when the idea here is, yes, you're going into we talked about the skills matrix. Yes, that helps get you in the door, but you're not just providing counsel there. And are you somebody who has actually had to think about, when COVID hit, right? What we found is actually, like, a lot of our directors found that the people who were most valuable were the ones who were really good about thinking about all kinds of unanticipated risk, but because they're constantly thinking about all kinds of pieces across the enterprise, they were just asking the right questions, right? So if you show me that thinking, as opposed to just, here's my lane, here's my function, and here's what I did, you won't stand out as much as the other person who can kind of hit on that, but then ties it up to, this is the impact, and this is why this is going to inform my thinking for the board. Yes,
Great.
somebody
Thank
said
you.
kind of having altitude on your own career. Yes, it's
Yeah,
pulling up, right? At this point, you want to pull up. I mean, we have to do that even with our materials. We don't send board materials that are like 70 pages. We have to give the 2-page, right? We have to pull up.
Okay, so I guess you were on the questions that boards and the recruiters want to know. Sorry, we sort of deviated there a little bit, but they were important questions from the chat, I think.
So this is just so you guys have a little bit of a cheat sheet, really, right? So when we get a mandate, we have our research team as well, right? Kind of helping us to identify and do some of the initial scan, of kind of for who we want to bring into the conversation. So this just lets you understand the types of questions that we're asking or that they're looking at, right? The functional expertise, the P&L responsibility is always going to be, it's always the question, and they always want to know at what scale. So for those of you in your pitch who kind of put that in there, that's really helpful, because we know, okay, this is where you've operated, right? If it's been in the hundreds of millions to the multi-billions, it gives us a sense of also where to kind of place you. The board exposure. So it's especially when we're looking at first-time board directors, the question is always, well, if they're a first-time director, have they had any exposure, to their own board, right? Do they have, and like what you're trying to understand what that is, in what capacity. Have you had to present to the board? Have you been part of a particular strategic initiative that has brought you into the boardroom? Do you understand the role, and is there a comfort level there as well? Global experience, a lot of questions right now, looking for more and more experience on the ground in China and in Brazil, right? But so some of those questions will come up. And then these questions around transformation, what kind of efforts have you led? And if the activist investor, kind of just now having more and more of that expertise people are looking at. So this is more of a cheat sheet for you. To know a little bit about kind of some of the work we do on our back end. I think just in terms of just a recruitment process, this is, again, these are resources and references for you, right? The high level is obviously we spend a lot of time up front with boards directly to understand exactly what they're looking for so that we're clear in what we're looking for, right? What this nicely shows you is that the typical recruitment process is not, it takes a while, right? We've said kind of here, we've said 12 weeks, they can take longer than that, right? As well. So if you are involved in a process and you're not hearing back the next day, the next week, it's very different from an executive search where you might be being recruited and you'll hear with greater frequency. You shouldn't take that silence as not being wanted or needed. It's just, it's a different cycle, right? Because on the back end, think about, we're also socializing candidates with a nom-gov committee. We're socializing candidates with a broader set of directors. And so I don't know if there are any, maybe I can pause if there are any questions, but here people have asked, well, what can I do, right? If I'm a board seeker, right? How do I kind of, what's my next step, right? How do I get out there? We often say networking is great. It's important. It's necessary. You have to continue to keep networking. You know, our clients don't necessarily want to call us. They don't necessarily want to have to pay us, right? And often will go to their own networks, right? They will go through their own networks and ask and say, we have some seats opening up. Who do you know? It's changing a little bit because, again, with now these kind of the new, I would say, kind of new systemic pressures, and therefore getting introductions to new types of candidates, we are getting more and more requests. But there's still, I think, a natural tendency to want to check within your own network first. And so if you are networking with any other board directors that you know, right? If you're networking with Ellen, if you're networking with your mentors, right, or different business circles, and you've given a great pitch, that great pitch will kind of make its way, right? And eventually with timing, you might find yourself getting an opportunity because, you happen to network quite effectively.
So there are a few questions that I would pose here. So let me go first to the one on chat, which is, do executive search firms look at collateral coming in from potential board candidates via their website? And if so, what's the filtering process? So if somebody just sends something in blindly, I guess, to the network, well, that's not the way I would do it, but
yeah, so I don't recommend, I mean, what happens is we do get them, and actually, so we get them, and then we have what we have is kind of like a board seeker list, right? And so they do, it's actually, I would say they do come through, we do a quick scan, right? And then we do kind of try to classify and index them and have an ongoing board seeker list.
So the way I always phrase it, and I'm going to try this on you, DD, and can tell me if I'm wrong completely, which is, it seems to me that if you want an intro to somebody at an executive search firm, the right thing to do is find somebody who knows you well, who's willing to send a note to DD and say, hey, I know Sally, she'd be really great. Here's 2 or 3 sentences on her, and I'm attaching her board bio. Hope you get a chance to get to know her.
Yes, I would. Your network is not just about networking for other executives. Your network can be used to get to us. I might liken it to, for example, when people talk about in publishing, like the slush pile. And yes, every now and then you might go through and find a gem, but often, again, because somebody has come, if you've networked and then Ellen says you need to talk to this person, or another exec says you should talk to this person, the likelihood of then that person getting on my calendar is much greater. The other thing I would say is we're talking about boards, but if any of you ever reached out to for executive opportunities and you're not looking at that opportunity, you're not looking to move. If that is a firm that has a board practice, you may want to take the call anyway, so that you have a chance to then say, I'm not looking, but I am interested in boards. And then you're in the conversation. So that's another thing that we see. that happens often.
So when you think about the networks, the story I always tell to folks is, you kind of have to think about, you only have so much time, but if you think about the people you know, and I'll call it group A, B, C, D, E, and you know, you have a group, but your A group are people who know you well professionally
Mm-hmm.
and who currently sit on public company boards, because they're going to be the ones who sort of have the most connections in that network. I mean, that's the way I view it. Would you agree with that, or would you go at it a different way?
I think I think for both the likelihood of getting your name passed on and in a way that's, reputable, and also from a comfort level, I would first look at people who know you professionally. I would agree. Know you professionally, and actually, you could say they're currently sitting on a public board, or they're also those people who are just highly connected, right? And if they know you professionally, what's easy is they can speak, they can sing your praise, they can speak to, when they're talking to me, the level of detail and texture that they can provide is, surpasses anything else, right? So start there. That's why sometimes we say, even talking to your current CEO, right? Or even if you have, relationships with people on your company's board, but doing that with people who know your work, who are well connected. Somebody asked, and that might link to that question about not-for-profit boards, right? Now this always can, and Ellen, I'd love your perspectives here, because this is a question that comes up often. And I would say that if it's a nonprofit board that has really prominent, I'm going to be very blunt. If it's a not-for-profit board that has kind of prominent board directors or prominent directors who are on some great public boards or some great for-profit boards, then at least you're getting and this is your only board engagement. Those are relationships, and those are people who are seeing you in action in a different capacity. Otherwise, I say the not-for-profit board experience is because it's a passion, right? I don't necessarily look at it as like the stepping stone to getting onto the for-profit board. But Ellen, I'd love your thoughts here.
I pretty much agree with that. I phrase it slightly differently, in the sense of, to me, being on a not-profit board for the sake of not-profit board does not get you onto a corporate board, period, end of subject. I've never seen it happen. And unless you're on the board of the National Association of Corporate Directors.
Yeah, exactly.
The room is filled with CEOs and public company directors. So, I mean, now we're back to your point, Dee Dee, about who's in the room, right? And who's at the table. But generally speaking, in 90% of the cases, unless you're at some gigantic nonprofit, it's not going to get you on. But what it does do is, when you are in conversations, and if you have had a leadership role on the not-for-profit, usually you come off a little bit more experienced than somebody who has no not-for-profit experience. So it won't get you necessarily into the room, but it could potentially be a differentiator if you get good experience on that not-for-profit board. If it's just a not-for-profit board where you're writing checks, I'm sorry, it's interesting, but it's not going to help you get on the corporate board.
Yeah.
That's my view. I mean, so I'm where you are, Dee Dee.
Yeah, I think think about it. Who's your audience, right? Who's in the room with you? How are you? And actually, and keep thinking about it on this point around networking. One of the things that we have seen, we tend to do a lot of studies around diversity in the boardroom, and this point around networking. So we tend to have affinity biases in our networking. We network often with people who are like us, right? Which means that a lot of women are really great at networking with other women, really great. And while we wish that the entire kind of population of board directors, we wish we had like millions and millions of Ellens, right? The reality is that we don't as well. And so just encouraging you to really, like, when you think about networking, really actually broaden that, like, think, kind of think just think about who's in the room. Think about who's in the room, how do you actually share kind of what you're doing for those people who are in the room so they can share as well? That's all. It's a point I just want to make.
So, I think, Hillary, could you go on to the next slide? Because I want to spend a lot more time on this broadening your personal network slide that is I think that critical. Whoop, we lost it.
Yeah.
There you
Yeah.
go. Because Dee Dee, when you advise people, somebody wants to get on their first public company board or first corporate board, which is public, how long do you think they need to take in terms of really working at it before something comes along? And I'm going to assume that the individual is not a sitting CEO of a public company.
Right.
That's in a whole game of itself. Putting that aside, everybody else.
How long does it take? I mean, it takes a long time. It's not like the people have networked for years, right? Before it actually all comes together. So you could have been, I would say the moment you start thinking about engaging on a board is the moment you should start networking, right? Because so many things have to line up. And in fact, what happens is you'll get kind of repeat interactions with people. You have opportunities to then say, when we first spoke, I did this, now this has happened. So I think it takes a lot of time. I mean, it takes a lot of time, right? And everybody has day jobs and everybody has personal lives, right? So because, it takes a lot of time, to this point around, be thoughtful, right? About almost how do you get the most from your networking efforts, right? If you know a lot of people here, but you don't know some, and we have these circles here. Can you kind of put yourself in scenarios where just because you're not in that space, but maybe the right CEO, or a director, who has great relationships through NACD, maybe go to some event there where you can amplify your networking impact, as opposed to kind of just staying in your own close knit group. I don't know if I wasn't really articulate.
Here's another question I've been asked for often. I've had people who say, gee, I've done all this research on company X, and can you help me network into the board of directors of company X? And to which I say, that isn't how. Do we even think they're looking to add a board member? I mean, what would you say when, is that a good strategy or a bad strategy? It seems odd to me, but then look, I only know from my experience, so I could be completely wrong on this one.
I can tell you right now, no matter how much you kind of go in and try to solicit a seat or a relationship with somebody from the board of Netflix, doesn't mean you're going to get on the board of Netflix, right? So when counseling people, I would say, what's the objective? And you go back to the question of, why do you want to do this? And actually, I have not seen that be an effective tool, right? It's because, again, we talked about all the other pieces as to what they're looking for in a board. So you could kind of keep hammering away at that one company. What is helpful is to know the types of companies that, the types of industries that might be interesting to you, particularly if you are at that point where maybe you are moving from, maybe you are a sitting C-suite executive, you're thinking about the next phase, and we would be looking at you. It is good to have a perspective to say, I'm in healthcare, but I've seen like consumer needs or whatever, right? But I tend to not say kind of just go after that one company.
So there's one question here in chat that is, what organization or events would you recommend to engage in networking to meet executives and board members? I guess you're going to talk about that later, though, actually.
Well, I was going to pass because so we do have in kind of in the back, we do have different programs. I'm going to use this point. I know we're getting to the end of the hour anyway. So what I'll say is we do have a list of different programs. However, one of the biggest ones that we always say is kind of, getting involved in and being a part of kind of, some of the things that NACD has to offer. It's actually great. I think I've gotten so used to thinking about that as the first choice that I think I was remiss and didn't put it in the list of things that you should be looking at the back. So I want to make sure I call it out. But I would say there are lots of different programs, you know, that exist. And we tried to kind of, you know, at least give you some options at the end of the deck.
Hillary, could you go back to the slide that we haven't yet done, which I think is an important one we've got time for? Exactly, interviewing for a board seat. Because I think, you know, it's sort of like now you've gotten, and it could be interviewing with Dee Dee. And it could be interviewing with Dee Dee, or it could be interviewing with the company, but there are sort of do's and don'ts here.
Yeah. So I would, when we are interviewing with you, or when you're interviewing directly with the board, we're asking you questions, we're trying to understand, but we're also listening for what you're asking us. So the people who come in and ask questions that make me nervous are often the ones that I'm like, okay, that's it. I need to, right, where they've done some homework and they're asking really kind of thoughtful, strategic questions about the, you know, kind of honestly about kind of the stage or state of the business and the enterprise, the needs at the executive level and how the board is addressing it. When you're getting into that level of detail, I get really excited and nervous because I definitely won't have all the answers, right? But I like that those are the questions that you're asking, you know? So I'm listening for what you're asking. I think you need to be ready. We say this, be ready to ask about the company, right? It can't just be that you're coming in and you have all these things about you and why you're great when we're talking about now this opportunity. We want to see that you've done the homework and the diligence. No longer are the director meetings where people just come and you just kind of have a nice meal and you have a good conversation where everybody agrees and you're on your way, right? Like the idea here is that there's a lot of room, even as kind of strategic stewards, there's a lot of room for engagement. And so even in our interviews, we're looking to see, how would you be, right? How are you doing the work? Are you asking those questions? Are you going to be a person in the room who's just going to go along to get along? Or are you going to be the person in the room who's actually going to challenge where appropriately and help to actually kind of move the board forward? And we start to see some of that in kind of how you're thinking about the questions with us.
So what do you think, what are the mistakes? What are the sort of don'ts in terms of interviewing for a board seat? So now you're now in front of the company. It's either one-on-one or maybe 6-on-1. I've seen both. What are the classic mistakes?
I think anything that smacks of really sitting in the space of the operator. So if your answers to questions, if everything really kind of goes to what goes to what would make, I would say, sometimes would make the CEO nervous, or sometimes make members of the C-suite of that, not that they're in the interview, but if they're listening and it sounds as though you don't necessarily yet understand kind of your contributions and that you're, you know, and you don't understand the line of responsibility. I will tell you, I just had this feedback for a candidate we just brought in. The candidate it was too one-way, too one-sided. So to the point, I think, Hillary, you made at the very beginning, monologue versus dialogue, right? If there doesn't feel like a good exchange, and if then later we get the feedback, they were too chatty, they didn't ask, we didn't get a sense, and we felt like they were giving us their stump speech, right?
So I remember one board interview that I just botched after, this was only about 5 years ago, and it was, you know, I thought I, you know, had it down pat and, you know, did all my preparation, had my questions, did everything. And, you know, I walked in there and it was sort of like I did everything you're not supposed to do is what I did. And
Tell
it's
us.
just like you could almost see yourself as I was doing things, I was going like, I know I'm not supposed to have done that. And I mean, and in that case, I was almost so over prepared. It was chatty, but it was like asking questions. And so it sort of never came back to asking me questions. You know what I mean? It was the one way, the wrong way, but it was one way. So it comes back to you got to have a dialogue. You got to have So even, you know, you can always botch it, right?
There's always a chance.
There's a wonderful question here on the chat board, which says, what value is placed on your experience working with your board and board committees? So let's say you're a C-suite, you have experience having worked with a committee or, you know, of the board, you know,
I
how
want to
does
hear it.
that play?
I want to hear it. So especially when we're talking about first-time directors, then the first question is, okay, well, what's their experience with their existing board, right? And sometimes we ask, like, does your board know? Do members of your board know that you're interested in board work, right? But I want to hear it. That's like almost like if there's no reason not to share that. In fact, because that's incredibly valuable. Right? Again, it gives us a proxy for, you know, what happens in the boardroom. You understand the engagement and the relationship with directors. You have a sense of how to communicate, right, in that setting. There's a certain comfort level, right? And then committee engagement is fantastic, right? Because you actually understand, again, if you're not sitting on a board, this gives you the next best thing of kind of being close and in the room, right? And so I think people want to hear that. We definitely want to hear it.
So here's an interesting question from Maggie, who says she's interviewing with an international board. At what point should she be actually going over to meet the CEO and the other board members? I mean, what is your experience from a board search for international boards?
So in COVID, it might be a little bit different. What I would say, you know, because we have been doing, and I don't know, some of this might stick for a little bit. So we've been doing the upfront kind of initial, not the long list. We don't have long lists for, you know, but like when you start interviewing, you have those first rounds with the directors, right? But then as we're paring it down, if we're paring it down to a set of a couple of finalists, right? Whether it's like 2 to 3 finalists, that's when we then have that's when we have them actually kind of going over and making those arrangements for those in person. The CEO is often part though of, if we're really serious about a candidate, while they're not running it, right? We do have candidates meet the CEOs in kind of that first or second pass, depending on scheduling, right? But I would say, because of what we've seen over the last 18 months, that maybe gone are the days where we've had, you know, maybe your sub finalists or what have you kind of going and meeting in person, but we definitely are reserving that for those kind of final 3.
Thank you.
So are there any other questions? Actually, why don't we go to the, Hillary, is it possible to go to the other viewpoint so we can see all the participants? I think we can do that.
Okay.
Let's see. I'm going to change my view here to gallery view.
Gallery view.
Okay.
Valerie, yes. Hi,
So,
everybody.
yeah, I'm just kind of bringing everybody up because you know, we're now at 6:07. We've got about 10, 12 minutes left. Are there any other questions we haven't asked during this? You could raise your hand. You could speak out.
Hi, it's Sandy. I have a question about HR and the role on boards. What is happening that would put the CHRO on a board versus having them present, you know, an update to the board? I mean, what is that tipping point? What is going on?
Meaning, meaning for, like, if I'm the CHRO of Nestle, what might make me attractive to me, meaning, so not for your own company, what you're saying is kind of what's happening that's making the CHROs more attractive as potential director candidates?
Yes.
Well, I would, a few things. I think crisis management and dealing with people, particularly if, and depending also on the experience of the existing CHRO, but we did see a little bit of an uptick, for example, in having HR expertise, you know, in the kind of immediate wake of COVID, right? and just kind of because in terms of things that they hadn't anticipated. Or I would say when you are looking for additional expertise because you know you have significant transactions potentially coming up that might impact kind of workforce, especially in maybe kind of newly public or smaller public enterprises, right? Where we're seeing that as well. And then honestly, one of the things that's keeping a lot of CEOs up at night has to do with actually the changing demographics of the workforce.
Okay.
Right? And actually now this fight for talent, and what kinds of things should they be doing and looking ahead to ensure that they are prepared to actually attract talent from all over the world. So that, whereas that used to kind of be a side agenda, because quite frankly, the expectation was everybody's going to get a job. We're a great place to work. You need to work, and we're kind of in the driver's seat. It's tipped, right? You've got now, right? You've got a generation of kind of people entering the workforce who actually are in the driving seat. They're making demands of their corporations. They're moving with their feet. A lot of companies are freaking out right now as they've kind of waffled back and forth on their work policies. And some of that, right? And so having, the difference is, so somebody who's been a serial CHRO, particularly if there's somebody who's worked in legacy large enterprises, but also has maybe also had experience in some of these companies where the demographics have shifted dramatically. If you can kind of tie that, that's interesting to companies as well.
Okay.
And those CHRs
aren't most CHROs tend to be women as well?
Yes.
And increasingly BIPOC women as well. So yeah,
we've seen it's
good question.
Yeah, like CHROs, I would say have also seen more kind of openness to like chief marketing officers. I've just seen kind of more functions opening.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
I have a question. Dina?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again for coming. I really found your comments insightful. One question that I had is, you mentioned that boards are increasingly looking at investment professionals. And I wanted to know what capabilities they're wanting from investment professionals. The reason why I asked, that's my former background. And I just, wanted to get your perspectives in terms of, how, what types of things I should be emphasizing to boards.
So I think with an investment professional, that's actually, I say that was a smaller, it is more of a number, it's a smaller one. Sorry, I should lean in, right? And probably I would actually, that one I'm gonna have to, I would actually, let me follow up offline to see if I can even pull, because I think that's pretty specific, right? And so I'm happy to see if I can even kind of pull and follow up offline with you in terms of kind of why, kind of, that's pretty specific.
Great.
So why don't we go to Regina? Regina's got her little hand up there, and then we'll go to Juliet after Regina.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. So Dee Dee, I love your presentation. I wanted to follow up in terms of what Sandra was talking about in terms of what you're seeing for trends, and you started to touch upon it with Chief Marketing Officer, but what are you seeing as far as the marketing function besides digital? In terms of requirements that they may be, with the
like
requirements.
What kind of chief marketing officer are they looking for?
Or I mean, does it have to be a chief marketing officer? But in terms of the marketing function.
So I would say when we look, well, I'm not sure. What I would actually say is more and more we're looking at chief marketing officers who look like either chief commercial or chief growth officers, right? Or who look like people who have a heavier on customer experience, right? So it's not just, I don't think it's just the digital piece, right? I think it's actually they're looking for, so the title hasn't changed for a lot of companies, but the responsibilities of CMOs in some industries has shifted dramatically, and they really are kind of more of the chief growth. Right? And so we're looking for a lot of that DNA in the CMO.
So I'm going to say something that you might not agree with me, Dee Dee. so I'm saying it to be provocative. Titles do matter. When boards are looking at people's qualification, having a title of X or being on the C-suite of a CEO matters. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it does. It does. So,
Glad I got it right.
First, so it doesn't mean that we don't kind of go, we have to prioritize as well, right? When we're doing this work. So I do think titles matter. We are looking at kind of this, we are looking at the C-suite. We're looking at that as a proxy for kind of your exposure to some of the things we've talked about in terms of just enterprise-wide thinking, being a member of the executive leadership team, your engagement and interaction with the board, right? So yes.
So Juliet, you've got the last question for the evening.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. I'm Juliet Mayers. I've really enjoyed your presentation, Dee Dee, and great to see you, Ellen. My question actually was around, I had to do with titles, right? Because, for example, I'm someone who's had a lot of responsibility without necessarily, when I was in corporate, with titles like, head of multicultural marketing. It's not a C-suite title, but yet I work directly with the CEO and work directly with a lot of the senior leadership. I'm now an entrepreneur who is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and working with a lot of companies both on diversity and ESG and multicultural marketing. But those titles, as they're described and outlined in a lot of the board opportunities, don't necessarily line up. So my question is really around, how does one get past that, given I know for a fact that a lot of my experience is far beyond a lot of people with titles, even with CMO and other titles. So I'm just curious to hear what you have to say about that.
So when I think at one point we said, even in the beginning, where a lot of our work these days with our clients is actually how can we be more flexible around, and I would say flexible, but also direct about the skill sets that we're looking for. And the reason we have that conversation up front when we're thinking particularly about the spec, right? We actually, before we go out, we will say, yes, this is what you're looking for. Can we unpack what skill sets we're looking for and what experiences that we want to kind of account for? Because that's going to give us more room to have a greater pool of candidates. We plant that flag up front so that actually we then can come back and say, look, there are only so many. The fact of the matter is there are only so many CMOs. And yes, while you would like to see one, you've also said to us that you would like an Indonesian woman in this role as well, right? And so what we've done is we've said, okay, well, here's what we've done our research and here's why we think, right? So if you don't have that title, but you have those responsibilities where you've been able to kind of lead a particular business, you've kind of revenue growth, you've navigated a turnaround, you've done a brand campaign that has kind of taken the company, right? If you can do that and that gets onto our radar, we can still tell that story, right? But the reality is, to Ellen's point, if when we first have that first conversation, when our researchers go out too, they are first looking to say, okay, how many CMOs are out there, right? Often, because of where we are, they're going to come back and say there were 5. We're not going to go. And so then we get to go and do the real work, right? Which is, and then we have a more robust conversation with the client.
Yeah. So the way I think of it, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the way I think of it is that, look, just because you don't have the title doesn't mean you shouldn't make the effort and try. Just realize that without the title, it's just going to be that much harder. And so you really need to focus on, again, the value that you bring to a board that really differentiates you from other people, and even other people who have the title, right? Dee Dee, you've been incredible. I hate to bring this to a close, but we vowed we'd bring it to a close by 6:20, and I know I got to hand it back to Hillary. You are amazing. I'm so grateful. We're so grateful that you gave your time and effort to do this and to put the presentation together and to impart your wisdom. So thank you. And for those of you who don't know it, I am a huge fan of Egon Zehnder. Dee Dee works for an incredible organization. does board searches across the globe, has the most amazing group of individuals, and Boston, New England. I'm not sure. Yeah, I know Lisa Blay, you know.
So
friend-
we have the benefit of having the head of our practice based in Boston. I sit right next to her.
She's
So
amazing.
she's amazing.
She
She's
sits on a
amazing.
board with me, so I
Yeah.
love her.
So-
With that, Hillary?
Yeah, so fantastic discussion. Just a reminder, we will be sending the presentation. So be looking for the Boston Club. It will be like, click here, a little tiny click here and get the presentation. If you don't get it, you can call me. Happy to get it to you, but fantastic program. Dee Dee, thank you. A round of applause.
No, thank you guys.
Virtual applause. Excellent. And Ellen, your questions were wonderful. And thank you to all of you for participating through the chat. We will see you September 20th for our next program on the role of the board versus management. So stay tuned. Have a great summer, everybody. And we'll see you September. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.